You people always mess things up." The sentence didn't echo loudly, but it cut clean through the warm hum of the restaurant like a blade made of ice. And for a brief second, even the soft jazz in the background felt like it had stepped back to listen as glasses hovered midair and conversations paused just enough for discomfort to settle in. Nia Carter stood there with a tray balanced in her left hand, her right hand still slightly extended from setting down a glass of sparkling water, her posture straight, her expression calm. But her eyes caught the shift in the room before anyone else dared to acknowledge it, because she had learned to read silence the way others read words, and silence like this always meant one thing. Someone was about to be blamed. The customer didn't look at her directly. Not really, just past her, through her, as if she were part of the furniture that had somehow malfunctioned, and the manager, already moving quickly from across the polished marble floor, wore that tight, rehearsed smile that never reached his eyes. The kind of smile that signaled decisions had already been made before facts had a chance to speak. The glass hadn't even tipped, not a drop spilled. But that didn't matter. Not here. Not in a place where reputation was currency and truth was negotiable. And Nia felt it before she heard it. The subtle tightening of the atmosphere. The quiet agreement forming among people who didn't want trouble, didn't want scenes, didn't want to risk anything for someone they didn't. "No, step aside for a moment," the manager said, his voice low but firm, and she did, because she always did, because she had learned that arguing in rooms like this didn't win you respect. It only made you visible in the wrong way, and visibility without power was dangerous. Time seemed to slow as she watched the exchange unfold without her, the customer gesturing vaguely, the manager nodding too quickly, too eagerly, as if each nod secured something more valuable than the truth, and somewhere behind it all, the low amber lighting reflected off crystal and polished wood, painting the entire moment in a kind of golden illusion that made everything look softer than it actually was. Nia's heartbeat stayed steady, not because she wasn't affected, but because she had practiced this kind of composure, the kind that keeps your dignity intact even when everything else is being stripped away piece by piece. And in that stillness, she felt the weight of every early morning shift, every late-night bus ride. Every dollar counted twice before being spent, pressing quietly against her chest. "We can't have this kind of mistake tonight," the manager continued. Louder now, just enough for nearby tables to hear, just enough to create distance between himself and her. And Nia noticed the way a few guests avoided eye contact, the way others leaned slightly closer to listen without appearing to do so, because curiosity was safe when it didn't require action. She opened her mouth, just slightly, not to argue, just to clarify, but the look she received, brief, sharp, final, told her everything she needed to know, and so she closed it again, letting the moment pass through her instead of breaking against it. The tray in her hand suddenly felt heavier, though nothing on it had changed, and she adjusted her grip, grounding herself in something physical, something real, because everything else in the room felt like it was shifting beneath her feet. No one raised their voice. No one made a scene. And yet something irreversible was already happening, unfolding quietly in a place designed to hide uncomfortable truths behind polished surfaces and curated elegance. And as Nia stood there, framed by soft light and silent judgment, she realized that what was about to happen next had very little to do with what was right, and everything to do with what was easy. And in rooms like this, easy always won, at least at first. The manager's decision landed without ceremony, without hesitation, as if it had been waiting for the slightest excuse to exist, and Nia felt the shift the moment he straightened his jacket and turned fully toward her, no longer pretending to investigate, no longer interested in details, just ready to conclude. "We are going to have to let you go," he said, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that left no space for questions. And the words settled into the air like dust that no one intended to disturb, while a nearby couple quietly resumed their conversation, their voices low but steady, as if the moment had already been categorized as something unfortunate yet irrelevant. Nia blinked once, slowly, not out of confusion, but to steady the weight pressing behind her eyes, and she nodded before he even finished speaking, because she understood the script. She had seen it play out before, just never with her name attached to it. And in that understanding there was a kind of quiet clarity that kept her from reacting in ways that would only make things worse. "I did not spill anything," she said, her voice even, respectful, careful not to rise above the tone expected of her. But the manager did not meet her gaze this time, instead adjusting his cuff as if the conversation had already ended in his mind. "It is not about arguing," he replied, and that sentence, more than anything else, told her that the truth had no place here tonight. The tray was no longer in her hands now, set down somewhere she did not remember placing it, and her fingers felt strangely light, as if they had been carrying more than just glass and water, as if they had been holding on to something invisible that had just slipped away. "You can collect your things in the back," he added, softer now. Almost rehearsed kindness layered over a decision that had already erased her from the room, and Nia gave another small nod, the kind that signaled compliance without surrender, then turned with measured steps toward the hallway that led to the employee area, each step precise, controlled, because she refused to let the moment dictate how she carried herself. The hallway lights were harsher, cooler, stripping away the illusion of warmth that filled the dining room, and the hum of the refrigerator units in the back sounded louder than usual, like a mechanical reminder that life kept moving whether or not you were ready. And Nia reached her locker with steady hands, opening it slowly, taking in the small collection of things that marked her presence there: a folded sweater, a reusable water bottle, a pair of worn sneakers she kept for the walk home. Nothing more, nothing less. She did not rush, even though she could feel the expectation hanging in the air that she should leave quickly, quietly, without drawing attention, and instead she moved with intention, placing each item into her bag as if it mattered, because it did, because every piece represented hours of effort, days of endurance, and a life that extended far beyond the narrow judgment of one room. In the reflection of the metal locker door, she caught a glimpse of herself, posture still straight, expression composed, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to feel it. Not anger, not even sadness exactly, but something heavier, something quieter, the recognition of how easily people could be dismissed when they were not seen as essential. Footsteps passed behind her, co-workers moving carefully, some glancing in her direction, others choosing not to look at all, and Nia did not blame them, because she understood that silence was often a form of self-preservation, not indifference. Even if it felt the same in moments like this. She closed the locker with a soft click, slung her bag over her shoulder, and took a steady breath before turning back toward the exit, not rushing, not dragging her feet, just walking forward with the same calm dignity she had carried all night. Because even as something was being taken from her, she refused to let it take the one thing that still belonged entirely to her. And that was how she chose to leave. The night air outside felt colder than it should have for early fall, the kind of chill that slipped through fabric and settled quietly against the skin. And as Nia pushed open the heavy back door, the muffled sounds of clinking glasses and distant laughter followed her for just a second before the door shut behind her with a soft, final click, sealing off a place that had already decided she no longer belonged. She stepped onto the narrow service alley, the concrete slightly damp, the faint scent of rain lingering even though the sky above was clear, and for a moment she just stood there, not moving, not rushing, letting the silence expand around her like space she had not been allowed to have inside, her breath steady, her shoulders squared, her mind catching up to what had just happened. 6 hours earlier, she had walked into that same building with a full shift ahead, mentally calculating how many tables it would take to cover this week's expenses, how many hours she needed before her next online class payment was due, how many miles she would walk before the bus line opened at 5 in the morning. And now all of that had been erased with a single decision that did not even bother to look her in the eye. She adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, grounding herself again, the weight of it familiar, predictable, something she could control, and she started walking toward the street, her steps measured, not slow, not hurried, just steady, because she had learned that the way you leave a place matters just as much as how you enter it, even if no one is watching. But someone was, though not in the way she would expect, because behind the tinted glass of the dining room, a man remained seated long after his companions had resumed their conversations, his posture still, his gaze fixed on the exact doorway Nia had just exited through, his expression unreadable but his attention unwavering. as if something about the moment he had just witnessed refused to settle quietly into the background like everything else in that room. Outside, Nia reached the edge of the alley where it opened onto the street, the city stretching out in front of her in a blend of headlights, distant sirens, and the low hum of late evening traffic. And she paused again, just for a second, looking up at the buildings around her, their windows glowing with lives that felt far removed from her own, yet somehow connected in ways that did not always make sense. She exhaled slowly, a controlled release, not of defeat, but of adjustment, because that was what survival often looked like, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet recalibration of what came next, and she reached into her pocket for her phone, the screen lighting up to show missed notifications, a reminder about a payment due in 2 days, a message from her younger brother asking if she would be home before midnight, and she typed back a simple response. I am on my way. Because even now, even after everything, there were still people who counted on her showing up. The streetlight above flickered once before settling into a steady glow, casting a soft halo around her as she stepped forward, merging into the flow of the city. Just another figure moving through the night, unnoticed, uncelebrated, and yet carrying a kind of quiet strength that had not been diminished by what had just been taken from her. Because what the room had failed to recognize was that dignity does not come from a job, and it does not leave when the job does. It stays steady and unshaken, waiting for the moment when the world is forced to see it for what it truly is. Across the street, the city continued as if nothing had shifted, as if a life had not just been quietly rerouted behind a polished set of doors, and inside that same building, under the same amber lights that softened everything except the truth, Ethan Blake remained seated, his fingers resting lightly against the rim of a glass he had not touched in several minutes. His attention no longer on the conversation unfolding around him, but fixed on a detail most others had already dismissed. He had seen the moment, not just the surface of it, but the way it unfolded beneath the words, the subtle misalignment between accusation and reality, the way the manager moved too quickly toward resolution, the way Nia had spoken with measured calm instead of defensiveness, and it lingered with him now in a way that refused to dissolve into background noise. He was not a man unfamiliar with decisions made in rooms like this, decisions driven by convenience rather than clarity, and perhaps that was why it stood out so sharply. Because he recognized the pattern, the efficiency of it, the quiet sacrifice of someone easier to replace than to defend. His companion said something, a question about a deal, a number, something that would normally hold his full attention, but Ethan did not respond right away, his gaze shifting briefly toward the corridor that led to the back, as if tracing the path she had taken, and then back to the table, the disconnect between the two spaces becoming harder to ignore. He reached for his phone, not with urgency, but with intent, scrolling through a series of notifications before stopping on something specific, his thumb pausing for just a second before tapping into a live security feed, one of several that monitored the property, a standard system, nothing unusual, except that tonight, it held something more than routine footage. The screen displayed a grainy but clear angle of the service area, time-stamped, unedited, and there it was, the exact moment. The glass steady in Nia's hand, the customer's gesture exaggerated, the absence of any actual mistake, and Ethan watched it once, then again, not because he needed confirmation, but because he understood what it represented, not just an error, but a choice, and choices like that had consequences that extended far beyond a single shift. He leaned back slightly, the soft leather of the chair adjusting beneath him, his expression composed but his thoughts precise. Calculating in a way that did not rush to conclusion but moved steadily toward it, and he closed the feed without drawing attention, placing the phone face down on the table as the conversation around him continued, unaware that something had already shifted in a direction none of them expected. Outside, Nia had reached the corner where the street widened, the rhythm of the city pulling her forward, and she adjusted her pace slightly, aligning with the flow of pedestrians, her mind already moving ahead to what came next, not dwelling, not replaying, just planning, because that was what she had always done, adapt, adjust, continue. A car passed slowly, headlights sweeping briefly across her face, illuminating the calm set of her expression before fading again into the night, and behind her, unseen but no longer uninvolved. A decision was forming, not loud, not immediate, but deliberate, the kind that did not seek attention, only resolution, and somewhere between the quiet dignity of the one who walked away and the measured awareness of the one who had watched it all unfold, the balance of the story had begun to shift in a way no one in that room had yet realized. The city moved forward in its usual rhythm, steady and indifferent, but beneath that surface, something quieter was beginning to take shape, something that did not announce itself with noise or urgency. And inside the restaurant, Ethan Blake finally pushed his chair back with a subtle shift that drew just enough attention to signal he was done, not with the meal, but with the moment, his napkin folded neatly beside his untouched glass as he stood, his posture calm, composed, but purposeful in a way that did not invite interruption. "I will step out for a moment," he said, his voice even, offering no explanation, and no one at the table questioned it because men like him were rarely asked to justify their movements, their decisions, or their silence. He moved through the dining room without haste, passing tables filled with conversations that carried on as if nothing had happened, yet his presence altered the air slightly, a subtle shift that only those paying close attention might notice. And when he reached the hallway leading toward the service area, he paused just briefly, not to hesitate, but to align his thoughts with his next action, because he understood that what he was about to do was not about impulse. It was about correction. The manager was already there, speaking in low tones to another staff member, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who believed the situation had been resolved. But that confidence wavered for just a fraction of a second when he saw Ethan approach. The recognition immediate, the adjustment instinctive. "Mr. Blake, everything is under control," the manager said quickly, stepping forward, his tone shifting from authority to accommodation. But Ethan did not respond right away, instead holding his gaze for a moment longer than expected, not aggressive, not confrontational, just steady, the kind of look that required honesty without demanding it outright. "I watched what happened," Ethan said finally, his voice quiet but precise, each word placed with intention, and the manager's posture tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift that revealed more than any explanation could. "It was a misunderstanding," the manager replied, just as smoothly, just as quickly, but Ethan shook his head once, not dismissively, but with certainty. "No, it was not," he said, and in that simple correction, the balance of the conversation shifted completely. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone again, and without raising his voice or drawing attention, he turned the screen slightly, just enough for the manager to see the paused frame, the timestamp, the clarity of what had actually occurred, and the silence that followed was not dramatic, not loud, but heavy in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. Outside, Nia continued walking, unaware that her story was still unfolding behind her, her steps carrying her past storefronts beginning to dim for the night, past people whose lives intersected with hers only for a second before continuing on their own paths. And she kept her focus forward, because that was how she had learned to move through uncertainty, not by looking back, but by choosing the next step with intention. Inside, Ethan lowered the phone, his expression unchanged, but his decision now fully formed. "I would like her information," he said, not as a request, but as a statement of direction, and the manager hesitated, just briefly, caught between explanation and compliance, before nodding, because even in spaces built on hierarchy, there were levels that could not be ignored. And as that information began to surface, piece by piece, something larger than a single moment of unfairness was beginning to realign, quietly, deliberately, guided not by chance, but by the recognition that what had been dismissed so easily was, in fact, something worth correcting. The name sat quietly on the manager's tablet screen, simple, unremarkable at first glance, and yet in that moment it carried more weight than any reservation or VIP list that had passed through those doors that night. "Nia Carter," Ethan repeated under his breath, not as a question, but as a confirmation, committing it to memory with the same precision he used for numbers, contracts, and decisions that shaped entire companies, because to him, names mattered when attached to moments like this, moments that revealed more about a place than any polished review ever could. She should still be nearby, The manager offered cautiously, his tone shifting again, this time edged with uncertainty, as if trying to anticipate what direction this situation might take. But Ethan had already turned slightly toward the exit, his focus no longer on the explanation behind him, but on the possibility ahead of him, because he understood something the room had overlooked. That timing mattered, and some windows, once closed, did not reopen the same way. Outside, the street had grown quieter, the late evening traffic thinning into a steady but softer flow, and Nia had reached the bus stop at the corner, the metal bench cool beneath her as she sat, her bag resting beside her, her phone in her hands as she checked the schedule, calculating the next arrival, measuring time in minutes the way she often did, because time, like money, had always been something she learned to manage carefully. She leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting upward toward the streetlight above, its steady glow offering a small pocket of consistency in a night that had shifted so quickly, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it, not overwhelming, not consuming, just present, like a quiet acknowledgement of change. Behind her, footsteps approached at a measured pace, not hurried, not uncertain, and she did not turn immediately, not out of indifference, but because she had grown used to people passing by without notice, their paths crossing hers without intersection. But this time, the footsteps slowed, then stopped, and a voice, calm and deliberate, broke through the ambient noise of the street. "Nia Carter," it said, not loudly, but clearly enough to carry intention. She turned then, her expression composed but alert, meeting the gaze of a man who did not look uncertain, who did not look like he had stumbled upon her by chance, but rather like someone who had made a decision and followed it through. Ethan stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but direct, his presence distinct not because of display, but because of clarity, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them holding a quiet tension, built not from conflict, but from the weight of what had just occurred and what might come next. "I believe there has been a mistake," he said finally, his voice even, measured in a way that did not seek to overwhelm but to acknowledge, and Nia studied him for a brief second, not searching for status, not measuring appearance, but listening for sincerity, because that was something she had learned to recognize quickly. "There have been a few tonight," she replied, her tone steady, not defensive, not dismissive, just honest, and something in that response, in its simplicity, confirmed what Ethan had already seen, that she was not defined by the moment behind her, but by how she stood within it. The bus headlights appeared in the distance, a soft glow growing gradually brighter, signaling movement, continuation, but for the first time that night, the direction of Nia's path was no longer entirely set by necessity alone, because standing there, under the steady hum of the streetlight, with a decision already forming on one side and a quiet resilience holding firm on the other, the story had reached a point where what happened next would not simply follow routine, it would begin to rewrite it. The bus slowed as it approached, its headlights casting long streaks of white across the pavement, but Nia did not move toward it, not yet, her attention still fixed on the man standing in front of her, because something in his presence did not feel accidental, and she had learned to trust that instinct, the quiet signal that told her when a moment mattered more than it first appeared. Ethan took a small step closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance just enough to make his words carry with clarity. "I reviewed the security footage," he said, his tone steady, grounded in fact rather than emotion, and Nia's expression shifted just slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if a missing piece had quietly been placed back where it belonged. "Then you already know," she replied, her voice calm, her posture unchanged, because she did not need validation to understand what had happened, but she understood the weight of someone choosing to acknowledge it. The bus doors opened with a soft mechanical hiss, a pause in the background of the moment, and a few passengers stepped off, their footsteps quick, their focus elsewhere, unaware of the quiet exchange unfolding just a few feet away. And still, Nia did not move, not because she was waiting, but because she was deciding. Ethan nodded once, not dramatically, just enough to confirm. "Yes, I do," he said. And then there was a brief silence, not empty, but deliberate, the kind that exists when both sides understand more than what is being said out loud. And I also know that what happened in there was not just a mistake. He continued, his words measured, careful not to overstep into assumption, but clear enough to define the moment for what it was. And Nia held his gaze, not challenging, not yielding, simply present, because she had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. The bus remained at the curb for another few seconds, its engine idling, a quiet reminder that time did not pause for personal turning points. And then the driver glanced toward them, waiting, but when Nia did not step forward, the doors closed again, and the bus pulled away, its taillights fading into the distance, carrying with it the version of the night that would have continued unchanged. Ethan noticed, but he did not comment on it, because he understood that the choice she had just made was not about transportation, it was about possibility. "I would like to offer you an opportunity," he said, finally. Shifting from observation to action, his tone still even, but now carrying direction, and Nia's brow lifted slightly, not in disbelief, but in caution, because she had heard promises before, and she had learned that not all of them were meant to be kept. "An opportunity to do what?" she asked, her voice steady, grounded, refusing to be pulled by assumptions or expectations, and Ethan allowed a small pause before answering. "Not for effect, but to ensure clarity, to work in an environment where accuracy matters, where people are evaluated based on what they do, not what is convenient," he said, each word placed with intention, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in Nia's expression, not excitement, not relief, but something quieter, something more careful, the recognition that this was not a simple offer. It was a turning point that required more than a quick decision. A car passed behind them, its headlights briefly illuminating both of their faces, highlighting the contrast between someone who had been dismissed too easily and someone who had chosen to step in. And in that light, the moment felt less like chance and more like alignment, the intersection of two paths that had been moving toward this exact point without either of them fully realizing it. Nia adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, grounding herself again, her mind moving through the layers of what this could mean, not just for tonight, but for everything that came after. And she looked back at Ethan, her gaze steady, her voice calm. "I do not accept things just because they appear at the right time," she said, not as rejection, but as clarity. And Ethan nodded again, this time with a faint understanding that matched her tone, because he did not expect immediate agreement, only consideration, and in that exchange, something rare settled between them, not obligation, not pressure, but mutual respect, the kind that does not need to be announced to be understood. And as the city continued to move around them, unaware of the shift taking place under a single streetlight, the next step in the story was no longer about what had been taken, but about what would be chosen. The night settled deeper around them, the glow of the streetlight casting long, quiet shadows that stretched across the sidewalk, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because both understood that the next words would carry weight beyond the moment itself. Nia shifted her stance slightly, her feet grounded, her posture still composed, and she looked past Ethan for just a second, watching the empty space where the bus had been, as if measuring the path she had just chosen not to take. And when her gaze returned to him, it carried something steadier, something more deliberate. "If I say yes," she began, her voice calm but firm, "it will not be because I need to be saved." And Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged but attentive, because he recognized the importance of that distinction, the line between opportunity and obligation, between respect and rescue. "It will be because I choose where I go next," she finished, and the words settled between them with clarity, not defensive, not distant, but defined. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, not as agreement alone, but as acknowledgement. "That is exactly why I am here," he replied, his tone even, grounded in the same measured calm that had guided him from the moment he noticed what others ignored. A faint breeze moved through the street, lifting a few strands of Nia's hair before settling again, and somewhere in the distance, a car door closed, the city continuing its quiet rhythm, unaware that something significant had just shifted in a space so small it would never make headlines, and yet carried a weight far greater than most of what did. Ethan reached into his jacket once more, not with urgency, but with intention, and this time he held out a simple card, clean, unembellished, his name printed in sharp lettering, along with a direct number that bypassed every layer of distance most people never crossed, and he extended it toward her without insistence, leaving the space for her to accept or decline without pressure. Nia looked at it for a moment before taking it, her fingers steady, her eyes scanning the name briefly before lifting again to meet his, not impressed, not overwhelmed, just present, because she understood that titles meant little without action, and tonight, action was what mattered. Tomorrow morning, Ethan said, his voice steady. 8 o'clock, my office is downtown, 23 floors up, reception will be expecting you, but only if you decide to come. And there was no urgency in his words, no attempt to persuade. Only a clear direction offered with the same respect he had shown since stepping into this moment. Nia held the card lightly between her fingers, feeling the texture of it, the weight of what it represented, not just a job, but a shift in trajectory, and she nodded once, not as acceptance yet, but as acknowledgement. Because decisions like this were not made in a single breath, they were carried, examined, understood before being acted upon. I will think about it, she said, her voice steady, and Ethan inclined his head slightly, accepting that answer without hesitation, because he knew that the strongest choices were not the fastest ones, and with that, he stepped back, giving her space again, not lingering, not waiting for more than what had already been said. A car pulled up briefly at the curb before moving on, its headlights sweeping across them one last time, and in that passing light, the contrast was clear, not between wealth and struggle, but between indifference and intention, between what had been dismissed and what had been recognized. Nia slipped the card into her bag, her hand resting there for just a second longer than necessary, and as she lifted her gaze once more, the city did not look the same, not because it had changed, but because she had, just slightly, just enough to shift the direction of everything that would follow. And as Ethan turned and walked back toward the building, leaving her with nothing more than a choice and the quiet echo of a moment that refused to fade, the story moved forward, no longer defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she would decide to do next. The apartment was quiet when Nia stepped inside, the kind of quiet that held both comfort and responsibility, and she closed the door gently behind her, the soft click echoing just enough to mark the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another, her bag slipping from her shoulder onto the small wooden chair near the entrance as she exhaled slowly, not out of exhaustion alone, but out of the weight of everything that had shifted in a single evening. The dim light from the kitchen cast a warm glow across the room, illuminating the simple space she had built piece by piece, every item earned, every corner familiar, and she reached into her bag, pulling out the card Ethan had given her, holding it between her fingers as she walked toward the table, placing it down carefully, as if it carried more than just ink and paper, as if it held the quiet possibility of something larger than she had planned for. Her phone buzzed lightly in her hand, a message from her younger brother, asking if she had made it home, and she replied with a steady yes, I am here, before setting the phone aside, her attention returning to the card, to the name printed on it, to the number that represented a direct line to a world she had only ever observed from a distance. She sat down slowly, her elbows resting lightly on the table, her gaze fixed, not searching for answers, but allowing them to come, because she understood that decisions made in haste often carried consequences that lasted far longer than the moment that created them. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, marking time in steady, unchanging intervals, and she thought about the hours ahead, about the morning that would arrive whether she was ready or not, about the choice waiting for her at 8 o'clock, and she leaned back slightly, closing her eyes for just a second, not to escape, but to center herself, to separate what she felt from what she knew. What she knew was simple. She had done nothing wrong. She had carried herself with dignity even when it was not returned, and she had walked away without losing who she was, and that mattered more than any job she had lost. What she felt was more complex, a mix of caution and curiosity, of guarded hope and practiced restraint, because she had learned that not every opportunity was what it seemed, but she had also learned that not every door opened twice. She stood again after a moment, moving to the small window by the wall, looking out at the quiet street below, the occasional car passing, the distant glow of city lights reflecting off the pavement, and she realized that for the first time in a long time, her next step was not entirely dictated by necessity, but by choice. And that realization settled into her with a quiet strength that did not need to be spoken aloud. Morning came, without hesitation, sunlight filtering through the thin curtains, soft but certain, and Nia was already awake, dressed, her bag resting against her side, the card now tucked safely inside, not as a guarantee, but as a possibility she had decided to explore. The city felt different as she moved through it, not because it had changed, but because she had, her steps steady, her posture the same, her expression calm. And when she reached the building Ethan had mentioned, its glass exterior rising high above the street, she paused for just a second, not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement, because she understood that this moment was not about proving anything to anyone else. It was about stepping forward on her own terms. She walked inside. Without hesitation, her reflection briefly visible in the polished surface of the doors, a quiet reminder that the person entering this space was the same one who had walked out of another just hours before, unchanged in character, but no longer confined by what had been decided for her. And somewhere above, in an office that overlooked the city, a decision made the night before was waiting to meet the one she had just made. Not as a rescue, not as a favor, but as a recognition, because in the end, what changed everything was not power, not status, not even opportunity. It was the simple, undeniable truth that dignity, once seen, cannot be ignored.